I think the only way in which you can actually be vulnerable is when you do get to know yourself. And when I say you get to know yourself, it's all of the uglies that we are constantly running away from. You know, the fact that I had all of these questions about my upbringing, about my identity, about who I was, and not knowing myself for like a long time. I think when you are doing music, every single time as musicians, we are being confronted with ourselves, and we have a choice whether we're gonna lie about who we are. If you are able to get to know yourself and accept those things that you personally couldn't change, or even people in your life couldn't change, and you actually allow God, these are things that I've actually worked with God about, and then it's the grace of God that allows me to actually open up, because now the outcome that we hope for is so that people actually come to salvation. There's nothing that is more beautiful than somebody telling a story, telling the truth, because the truth always stirs people. The truth always moves people.
Welcome to the Follow Forward podcast, where we highlight real stories from global voices and Christ-centered servant leadership. I'm your host, Tim Tucker. Great to have you with us. And today I'm joined by Jabulani Majola. He is he's a husband. He's
Yes.
a friend. He's an artist, and he's someone who loves Jesus. And I think that's going to come out in this next half an hour or so as we have this conversation. Jabulani, welcome to the Follow Forward podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. I've been steeped in anticipation for this. I've been excited for it, and I'm honored to be here.
Great. Where I want to start is I always start because the Follow Forward podcast features people I'm in friendship with. We talk about being, as the message, being mates on mission, and people who have something of a track record with. So, but interestingly, Jabulani, how far our history goes together. So I'm going to start with this because not only in 2000, I think it was 2014, I got a phone call. From a man called Angus Buchan, who is reasonably well known in the South African context. He's a farmer, an evangelist, and someone who is just inspirational to me. Now, I had first met Angus in 2002 when I visited Greytown. Now, I'm going to bring these strands together. We're going somewhere with this, Jabulani. Stay with me. So I first met Angus in 2002 when I was doing soccer ministry in Greytown, and he phones me in 2014, and he says, "Tim, you're part of the message. You're doing something called the Message Academy. You're recruiting some young people to join your message band who are going to go to the UK. He says, one of my sons, Jabulani, you need to have Jabulani on your band." But he said, "But obviously you should go away and pray about it. Don't just take my word for it. Go and listen to the Lord and pray about it." And I said, I'd better ask the Lord. But if the Lord doesn't agree with Uncle Angus, then I'm in trouble. He was telling me about you, Jabulani, who had grown up with Uncle Angus, adopted into his family with 27 other youngsters who I had
26
actually
other
met.
siblings.
26 other siblings I had met in 2002 or 2003 when I'd been in Greytown doing football. So my story with you goes back to when you were a very wee lad, Jabulani.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But then got to know you when we did offer you the position to come into message as a rapper. And we're going to get into how this rapper becomes a Zulu folk singer at some point in our conversation, I'm sure. But I want to take us back to then your backstory. When I was at Greytown doing soccer ministry, you were a boy growing up with 26 others, adopted by Angus Buchan. Tell us about your childhood. Tell us about life as a child, and what some of the and I think the good and the bad of that. What were the blessings and the battles that you faced as a child?
Awesome. Funny enough, I remember, I think when you said you were part of Ambassadors, I remember saying, "Oh, they came to our home like not long ago." I mean, in 2002 and whatnot. And they came through a man named Ron Dean. At the
Yes.
time when Ambassadors was in Greytown, I still had a dream to be the next Dr. Kumalo. I had the dream to, to play professional football. This is before my brothers brainwashed me into playing rugby. But I was very into soccer like that. And so I definitely remember those big white t-shirts. I don't know why they were so big, but we wore those white t-shirts very proudly. So I think my story starts from when I was from 3 days after my birth. My mother disappeared without a trace. These are things that I found out later in my life. But then I was adopted when I was 4 months. It's like a whole story, and it's a very, very beautiful story. There's a lot of challenging parts about it, but then there's also a lot of beautiful moments within the story. And so I knew dad growing up. I just knew dad as my father. And what a ministry he's had, what a man of God he is. But growing up was not also so easy, because I think as you grow, you start to have questions, especially when you don't know your parents, or you don't know your mother, your father, and you don't know your blood relatives. You start to ask questions about where you actually come from, you know. And you also with a lot of siblings who have a similar story. So there's no getting answers from them as well, because you kind of are all in this melting pot and sort of going through this thing. And it's so crazy because when you have these questions, they tend to sometimes manifest or come out in different ways. I know that I used to struggle a lot with like attention seeking at a very young age. There was a lot of this me making myself up to be something that I was not. And it was very difficult to feel loved, even though I had people in my life that were affirming me, even though I had people in my life that were telling me that they loved me and that God had a plan for my life. It was very difficult to understand that God had a plan for my life. And we also grew up in a Christian home as well. And so growing, I often say growing up in a Christian home is both an advantage and a disadvantage, because you're constantly hearing the gospel. And when you hear the gospel so much, but then you never actually make a decision, your heart does become harder. It's actually, I only started to learn that when I was older, that, hey, this is actually something that happens. And so you have to, like, the gospel is a message that has to be responded to. When you hear the gospel, you have to respond. Whenever you meet with Jesus, there's always a response that is required. You don't just meet Jesus and then nothing happened. There's not that thing where you either accept or you reject. And so you we were sort of living in this like spiritual limbo, if I can maybe use an expression. It was like this spiritual limbo where you're constantly hearing the gospel, and it comes a point where whenever a preacher is preaching in the front, because you know it so much, you always feel exempt from whatever the person is actually saying. It always feels like, no, it's meant for the other people and it's not meant for me. And so to me, God became um he became like a grandfather, someone that is there, but I was not so fully aware of him like that. Not to say that grandfathers are people that people are not aware of. But for me, it just became like that, where it's like, I know he loves me. I don't have to be so into him because dad is doing that for me anyway. You know what I'm saying? And so it was like this, and obviously when you think about culture as well, because we had dad, this is the English side, and the way in which he taught us, but then also we were raised by Zulu speaking house mothers, and so then you see how these two cultures sometimes conflict, but then also how they marry each other and how they work together, to sort of build us up in the way in which we now reason and understand things. And I think the beauty about growing up in the way in which I grew up is the fact that I had a dad and a mom that actually understood the value of our ethnicity as Zulu children. And so I remember we were going to this like Model C English school or whatever that school was in Greytown, a very nice school. And I remember the one time when dad started to fund a rural school, a local school on the farm. He decided to take us all there. And this is where we really learned how to speak Zulu. This is where I learned to read and write. This is Zulu. And I'm sure we're going to speak about the Zulu folk. This is what informed that, I think when I look back in my life, I often go to that school. Whenever I get to go to KZN, if I have shows there, I always try to visit that school to encourage them. My dream was to build a library. Dad beat me to it, and so I try to donate books when I can. And so yeah, this is an epicenter where I actually really learned how to read isiZulu, hear Zulu stories, and also see how the Zulu people live. Sometimes when you are so-called an orphan, or you don't really know who you are, you can always feel like an outsider. But I've seen that there's also an advantage with being an outsider, because you become a very good observer. And so I learned how to see all of these different things, and how life sort of operates, and how people um, react to certain experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, fascinating. And obviously, with hindsight, we can see how God redeems some of those situations, and he is bringing good out of those negative or potentially negative situations, but actually then creating insights for you that give you something, I guess, unique. Because God has meets with us in a unique ways, but he also shapes us into unique people, and it's part of the beauty of the kingdom. But whenever I think of you, Jabulani, I remember the times when you did come to message. So you've mentioned your schooling and some of those formative years. I want to touch a little bit on your storytelling, because I remember you at the message. Always had a notebook in your hand, and you always muttering under your breath, and it felt, if I didn't know better, I'd have thought you were a lunatic.
Some people did think that anyway, don't worry.
Or maybe there's some lunacy that's healthy in all of us. But you were writing constantly. Back then, you were a rapper as part of the message. That's how you came to us. When your dad contacted me, you're doing spoken word and rapping. You were using words to articulate perhaps some of the deep things that were going on inside you. But you also were a storyteller, and you were able to share what you were saying as a storyteller. How did those elements of your giftedness that you had, how did that help you process some of your experiences, both the battles and the blessings of your upbringing?
I think in the area of battles, there was a time where I actually listened to a lot of things that I've done in the past, and I was so grateful to God that He gave me a gift that I could obsessively try and improve. My mission was never to try and improve and get better at what I do. It was always to do it well with whatever that I got to do within the arts, to actually just do it well, to know that I did well. I was actually talking to someone yesterday, and I said, I don't think about my work as whether it's good or bad. I think about it according to how much effort I've actually put in. I can go to sleep and say, what, today I labored on a song, or I did all of this. And so I think um, God provided this thing for me to actually cope with those times. I never see it as a thing where, I could escape from my darkness. No, it was more like a soundtrack that actually helps you create that song of hope, because I don't see hope as like this light at the end of the tunnel. I see it as the light within the tunnel, the light that anchors you and helps you get through to the outside of the tunnel. Because what happens when you get to the end of the tunnel and you see that light, there's not much to look forward to after that. But there's something about the anchoring within the darkness that we find ourselves. And so I thought about that, and I was like, yo, look, like, Lord, you've really blessed me with this. The fact that this has also become a blessing to everybody else, is also something else. And I think the good that this had is that it always got me to learn more about myself, and the way in which I am, and the way in which I show up in the world. I think sometimes we put so much into the work that we do, we put so much into the craft that we do, and then we sort of neglect our personal growth and how we interact with the world and how we love and serve people. you know I think the older I'm getting, I'm starting to realize that even this very thing is not that. It's very valuable, but it's not that important. It's not more important than my character. It's not more important than my service to people. Now I'm talking about actually loving people. When Paul says I can speak all of these languages, I can prophesy, but if I have not love, I'm just a noisy gong. And so it's interesting how God once used this thing to propel me through the dark times, but then now he's kind of made me understand what is actually more important, you know, which is my character, which is the love that I actually have for people, and which is also the purpose that he has called me to. Because now, I think as of late, I've started to realize that it's actually um, the music can also be a means to an end. There's more that God has called me to, you know what I'm saying? That sort of vibrates even further than the music. Yo, Tim, I get very excited when I talk about this because God has really met me, he's really dealt with me like on another level.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I,
yeah.
I love that. I think that, you know, most people, or very, at least a secular worldview, but I think it influences the church, sees success as the end and music as a means to success,
Mm,
or whatever gift or talent they've got. So the end is not necessarily the product. The end is the fruit of that product, which can often be very selfish, very, self-orientated. And that's why it can be elusive. Joy in that situation can be elusive. But if we have an end that is a different kind altogether, whether that's obviously glorifying God is one of those ends, blessing others and being a witness and a light for him, as well as his character being formed within us, which is what you were talking about. That completely changes the approach we have to the medium, doesn't it? To the
definitely.
music itself, because that's actually now it's almost the fulcrum or the crucible where God is stirring in order to form within us actually Christ,
Mm,
isn't it? That's
yeah.
that's what, um, and so that's what I'm hearing has been your experience, and the fact that in that fulcrum there's storytelling, there's reflection, there's self introspection and learning is all part of the process, and doing that in music makes it a very transparent thing that the world can get to look in
Mm,
on. um,
yeah.
um, and then again they're testing that with the fruit of your life and say, are these two things consistent or are they inconsistent? Because so often there's often an inconsistency between the art and the lifestyle, etc. But I'd imagine, Jabulani, that you would feel quite vulnerable sometimes in that space where you are exposing so much of yourself through your art. How do you cope with that? How do you're a transparent person, your heart comes through what you do. How do you protect your heart, both obviously in terms of this sense of vulnerability, but also working in the music industry that is quite a tough space?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It brings to mind the one of the lyrics of Leonard Cohen. I'm sure you know Leonard Cohen. Um, there's one lyric where he says, "I want to know my song before I sing it." I think the only way in which you can actually be vulnerable is when you do get to know yourself. And when I say you get to know yourself, it's all of the uglies that we are constantly running away from. you know the fact that I had all of these questions about my upbringing, about my identity, about who I was, and not knowing myself for like a long time. I think when you are doing music, every single time as musicians we are being confronted with ourselves, and we have a choice whether we're gonna lie about who we are, which is very prevalent within the industry, because we're also trying to sell music, we're trying to make money out of this thing. But I think the very important part about it, you are constantly being confronted by yourself. If you are able to get to know yourself and accept those things that you personally couldn't change, or even people in your life couldn't change, and you actually allow God. My vulnerability is not, it's not just a thing of like, oh, I know myself and I'm just vulnerable. These are things that I've actually worked with God about. And then my vulnerability comes from, it's the grace of God that allows me to actually open up, because now the outcome, or the outcome that we hope for, is so that people actually come to salvation. there's nothing that is more beautiful than actually somebody telling a story, telling the truth, because the truth always stirs people. The truth always moves people. And so I like that we use vulnerability, because vulnerability it's got weakness attached to it, But then also, vulnerability to me is honesty. Honesty will always make people respond. The amount of times I speak a lot to my pastor Sean. He runs Message South Africa. Um, every single time when he becomes vulnerable, maybe about something, hey, this is what I'm really going through, it always makes me respond if there is something that I'm struggling with. You know what I'm saying? Even if I'm at a point in my life where I'm not really trying to repent about it and all of those things, but I'm always shaken by it. I'm always convicted. There's something about this, that honesty that causes the Spirit to convict hearts, and that's what we're trying to do here. And so I don't have a problem with vulnerability as long as it is meant for that. I don't do it because I'm just like, oh, okay, I want people to know exactly who I am and whatnot. I think there's a purpose as to why I do it. And I think it's very important because we also live in a world that is very much about the makeup, about the masks, and portraying these images that are not true. It's like it's all glitter and gold, but then when you scratch behind the surface, it's just cardboard.
Have you found the shift in style of music and also in language enabled you to connect with people perhaps on a deeper level? Has it contributed to the impact of your music? And how intentional was that, or how has the Lord led you in that whole process?
Yeah. I always say to people, when I was rapping, I always knew that I could sing. When I was speaking all that English, I always knew I could really speak isiZulu. And the reason why is because in those moments, I never felt like I needed to use it. I never felt like it was something, it was the right time to actually do. I remember when I wrote my first Zulu song, everything felt so out of reach because, again, I'm a Zulu person, but then I'm also very English in my ways because of how we were raised and all of those things. So there's certain things, even when I write in English, there's so many things that are out of reach, but that's the beauty about it because every single thing is a step of faith. And so I found that what has caused me to write in the way in which I write is Zulu, because it's not also just like the Zulu language, but it's like the deeper sense of it. But that only comes from being a good listener. I would often go to Durban. I mean, after being in Cape Town maybe for a whole year, and then go to Durban and then hear the new slang and hear how people are talking and all of those things. And I would always like just pay attention because I'm like, yo, I'm really missing out. I should be living here and all of those things. But I think because I could listen to all of that, I'm able to actually formulate stories. And the point of the story is to let people relax, relax, so that I can preach to you in English. I think that for me it's a very important thing to be able to also hear what people are saying, because when you hear what people are saying, you might stumble upon what they actually need, you know. And so I think the transition from rap to folk music, at some point it was going to happen. I thought I was going to do it only this year when I was 30. I remember telling a friend of mine when I was about 21. I hadn't picked up the guitar. I hadn't done all of those things. I was like, when I'm 30, I'm going to be doing folk music. But I just didn't know which time. But then, I mean, it came in earlier and in a way in which I'd never imagined it would.
I think what, as someone who doesn't speak isiZulu, I feel that your message is almost beyond the words in that sense as well. There's something just about this young Zulu man with the vulnerability, of standing on a guitar on a stage on his own, sharing songs from his heart and his life and his experience. That alone seems to speak volumes and creates a connection, even with people who don't speak your language. And yes, maybe you share your testimony and the gospel in English, which crosses cultures,
Yeah.
and maybe enough times you're able to speak in Zulu. But the reality is the heart connection has been made, which because I think a lot of the gospel is breaking down barriers to the gospel,
Mm,
preconceived ideas
Yeah.
that people have to us as carriers of the gospel. People have these notions about who we are as believers. And a lot of the time, what we're seeking to do is saying, well, we're following Christ. And in as much as we're following Christ means that you're open to my message and my heart and my life. But people have got their preconceived ideas about that, either because of their hurts, because of what they learn on media, whatever it is. And so a lot of what we're seeking to do in the faith, isn't it, both in prayer and through our lifestyle, is just to get that door open, to wedge it open somehow so that we can expose people to Christ. And the real Christ, and beyond us, and then allow the Holy Spirit to work. And as the message, that's all we're effectively trying to do. Our name as the message as an organization is saying, that we have a message. Imperfect carriers of that message as we are, we recognize that what we're seeking to do is to do everything possible to lay our lives down so that others can be open to that message and have their hearts stirred by the one who has changed our lives. And I just see that seems to be a gift God has given you. And I love the example because, I feel that you're very intentional about making sure that your music transcends into spaces where people would not necessarily share your faith, and even working with other artists. So speak to me about the good things about that, but also the challenges of engaging the music industry as a whole as a Christian, rather than taking the safe bet and doing a church tour around South
Yeah.
Africa where we'd all just sing your praises and love you to death.
Which I need sometimes. The very beautiful thing. I just want to touch on the vulnerability aspect. The most amazing thing that happens. I don't believe that we cause ourselves to be vulnerable. God causes us to be vulnerable, and whatever we do, in truth, is that we do it in humility. I think sometimes I tell people when I'm playing, I'm like, I don't believe that everybody's here because maybe have a good voice or we doing this music thing. I think maybe it's the stories, or maybe it's just you probably just think I'm a cool person. I noticed that some people don't necessarily have anywhere to go and they just want to be in a space where they feel like they're a part of something, even if they can feel like outsiders and they don't understand the language. And I make the example when I went to this one rural school in KZN, where we used to have movie Fridays, and during the week our teachers would be collecting like 1 Rand 50, and if you didn't have a 1 Rand 50, you would stand outside and they would put blinders on the window so that you can't see inside. But I used to always imagine that the kids that were standing outside looking through the slits of the blinds, they had they actually enjoyed the movie the most because they were extra focused. And sometimes when you're the insider, you don't really pay attention to what is really happening because it's all kind of being spoon fed to you. And so I think the reason why people that don't necessarily understand the music gravitate towards it is because they also get to be observers, and I think they become acutely aware of everything. But then again, like I think the things that God has stripped away from me has caused me to do it also in a way that is super humble, understanding that, no, people don't have to accept it. People don't have to listen to it. But then I get to also do it in front of them because they want to be there. We're not forcing anybody to hear the gospel, but we do it in a way that is so humbling, not because of them, but because of what God has done to us. There's a way in which the closer you get to God, it feels like the more He breaks you, you know and then I feel like when you have been in that journey, everything that you tend to do is from that humble place, because you realize that there's nothing that you can do for yourself. There is nothing that you can also do to make the person accept the gospel. It's only the work of the Holy Spirit. All you are is just a vessel, channeling the truth through in a very careful way, because it's also a very powerful truth. It's a matter of life and death kind of situation. So you want to be very careful about that. So that's how I see it. And then I think how I navigate the industry. I'm very encouraged by the scripture. I think it's in John 15 where Jesus says, "Abide in me, and I'll abide in you." I think it's very important because the walk of Christianity is not an on and off switch. Okay, now I'm in the industry. Let me be like super holy and all of those things. Okay, now I'm in the church. I can let my guard down because everybody knows I'm a Christian. Um, one thing that I noticed, especially from the recent tour that I did, you know, they know that I'm a Christian because I like to talk about it, and I don't know. There's just you can see a Christian, um, but and one thing that I constantly was hearing my friends that I was touring with say is this thing of like, yo, your the way you live is very consistent with the way with what you preach. You know what I'm saying? This goes with, because we will talk about things. I'm not afraid to actually talk to people about Jesus. I'm not afraid to actually ask them questions about what they believe and all of those things. I I realize that it's so important. I remember when we were in Message UK, and Tim Owen used to be like, "Your off stage must match your on stage, your character," and
Yeah.
that character is so important. The way in which we carry ourselves on stage and off stage is so important because you can be so used to, okay, now I must change and just be this person, and then now I must change and be the other person, and the world actually is looking to see. They don't really hear, they hear your words, but they don't really care. They want to see your actions. They want to see how you're treating the people that came to your shows. They want to see how you're treating the sound guy. They want to see how you are handling pressure, because it's also a very pressure driven space, because then there's also this, I'm coming from a background of rejection. God has healed me through that, but there is even more rejection out there in the industry, because then you're like, okay, I don't drink. I'll still hang out with the all of you, but I won't drink. You'll always feel like an outcast. And people there are very like straightforward about what they think about you. And so you require strength. And the reason why I say we must abide in Christ and Christ abide in us is because if you're not abiding in him, these things can influence your faith, or can influence you out of your faith. And it's very important. And so one of the things that I do, and I do them very seriously, wherever I'm going, I've made sure that I do my quiet times. It is very important to fill ourselves with the word, because the word, there's a way in which the word actually also informs us who we are. Yes, we were sinners. Yes, we were living different lives before we met Jesus, but there's something about the word that centers us. And when we go out into the world, it's that which we have put in ourselves that starts to come out, when we are speaking to people. And also, God teaches us. I think each and every single day, God is teaching me to love people, because very easily we can also switch to the judgmental mode, because it's like, I don't do it. I don't do what those sinners are doing or what those people are doing. And so we having to actually be loving, to be sincere about our presence wherever we go. So it's a lot I can
Yeah.
say, but I think abiding in Jesus is
Yeah.
very important.
That is really helpful. And I think as you're speaking, there's two characteristics that I see in you that I think are worth emulating. The one, it's a cliche. It almost seems like a cliche now, but it's authenticity. People are using that word a lot, but I think we as Christians need to define what these words mean. And so when our walk matches our talk, and we're aspiring for that in following Christ, then that for me is authenticity. That's what that means. And we've seen that in our conversation today with your transparency and so on. But I also see in you, Jabulani, you're inquisitive. Do you think that's fair? You're an inquisitive
Yeah,
person, and
definitely.
carry that in you as well. And so inquisitiveness is a quality we need to have. I think it's a quality of part of the image of God within us, is that we want to keep on learning and we want to keep on growing. And in the years, okay, so I've known you since you were 3 years old.
Basically.
Professional footballer. But since I've really known you, I've seen that growth over this past 10 years. That you are an authentic leader in your own right, and influencing people within your sphere of influence towards knowledge of Christ. But you're still seeking to grow. You're inquisitive and you're teachable. You mentioned Sean. I was going to ask you about mentors and so on, but you brought that that up naturally, and I've seen how you've also surrounded yourself with people who be accountable, and now who you're holding yourself accountable to, and so that's great. So it's wonderful to see God working in your life, and so thank you for sharing on our podcast. Thank you for being one of the follow forward guests. It's been amazing to have you, and I've enjoyed. I didn't know what direction the conversation was going to go in. I've enjoyed it. Jabulani, I hope you enjoyed it too. Thank you for sharing from your heart. This is the Follow Forward podcast. These are real stories like Jabulani's, who has a global voice, who God is using around the world because he's a Christ-centered servant leadership. Thank you so much, Jabulani, for being here. And would you like to a final word from you?
Thank you so much, Tim, for having me. I honor the work that you guys have been doing, what Message has done. I consider myself a beneficiary of Message because I think the best thing that you guys could offer me was time. You mentioned that I'm quite inquisitive. I think you gave me time to actually learn. I think as I worked with people, I really I learned to listen. I learned to actually love people. So many times we can find ourselves working with people, but we have zero love for them. It's very possible to actually work with people and not love them. But I think when you are given a lot of time to spend with the same people in similar backgrounds, I think you start to develop a love. I also just wanted to mention that I think the DNA of the Message, which is going out there and making disciples, and using creative ways to reach young people, is something that hasn't left me because my wife actually we work in the community of Solaris Pass. We are in the community and working with young people, and it's so crazy because it feels as though God prepared me for this. I don't think I ever want to live a life that is not given over to the Lord, that is not given over to the missions, because God has given me that love for people. Again, it's not the love that comes from me and I feel like I can change the world. It's a love that is informed by God. When you love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, what he then does is that it gives you the love for your neighbor. It's not the other way around. It's not love your neighbor and then love God. It's love God, and then his love informs the way in which we love others. And so I think kudos to you guys for continuing to lay that foundation and identifying young people that you can mobilize into these communities.
Amazing. Thanks once again, Jabulani, for joining us on the Follow Forward podcast, and we'll see you next time in the future. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Follow Forward podcast. This may have been my idea, but I worked with an awesome team to make it come to life. Thank you to Lucy for guest management, scheduling, and being a real gap filler. Jordan for taking over the guest management baton, as well as doing content production, scripting assistance, and editing of these podcasts. Alistair and my lovely wife, Christina, for technical production, and Taryn for taking behind-the-scenes content and crew support. Whether you're watching or listening, make sure to hit that subscribe button on whichever platform you are on and share this episode with your friends so we can inspire even more people together. We release a new episode every Thursday, along with extra content to help you grow as a leader of people and a follower of Christ. Follow my Facebook page at Dr. Tim Tucker to access all the bonus content. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to send a DM or leave a comment letting us know what you enjoyed about the episode. God bless, and we'll see you next week.